to welcome Julian abroad to Nottingham. I have to say that I took advice about who to invite, who would give us a really fantastic talk about healthcare, and in situations like that, who does one ask but one's chief executive? And without any hesitation, he recommended you. He reminded me that probably your greatest task was to teach him economics when he was a young man. And that may be something that I think we are probably very grateful for, but I might ask you for some further details later on. Julian has worked in economics and has gradually moved into the healthcare economics sphere. He's the Richard Titmuss Professor of Social Policy at the London School of Economics, a more prestigious job in economics I can't imagine there exists. He has done frontline medical jobs, including being Vice Chairman of the French and Bristol Trust. He has been the policy advisor to Tony Blair. Now, I dare say he might just tell us a little bit about that. Obviously, some of the bits about that are going to be very confidential. We respect that, of course. You've chosen your own title, which I'm very interested in, and I hope you'll all be able to take a few questions at the end. So thank you very much indeed, Julian. If I could hand you over to the rector.
Thank you very much. Is everything working? Can people hear me? Okay. And thank you, John, for that introduction, and thank you, Peter, for the invitation, the recommendation, I should say, to come here. I have to say, what I'm going to talk about always rather reminds me of Machiavelli's dying words. As many of you probably know, he was, when he lay dying, he asked for the last rites. And a priest came in and said, Machiavelli, I've come here to give you the last rites. First of all, I have to ask you, do you renounce the devil and all his works? Silence from the bed. So the priest waited a few minutes and then said, Machiavelli, do you renounce the devil and all his works? Still silence from the bed. The priest said, look, Machiavelli, I have to ask this. I can't proceed any further without getting answered. Do you renounce the devil and all his works? Well, after a minute or two, there was a quiet voice from the bed saying, I don't think it's a good idea to make new enemies at this stage. Now, I'm afraid I might not make some new enemies at this stage, because somebody once described me as basically the person who's been responsible for all the troubles and trials you've been through in the past 20 years. Actually, I'm not. Peter was also greatly involved in that. Commission for Health Improvement. And there are other villains of the piece. But I am going to talk about basically the experience of the Blair government and the various reforms, deforms, some people call them, that the NHS went through during that period. And indeed, of course, as we all know, it's still going through now. And basically, we tried, there were basically 4 fundamental ways to run a health service. And I'm going to go through those in a moment. We tried them all. In the Blair government. They're all bad. None of them work. Some maybe work slightly less badly than others. And that's the kind of message I'm going to give you. And the one the one I was sort of involved mostly in is probably the one that you will regard as the one most over on the dark side. So I'm looking forward to being torn apart by you when the questions come. Okay, well, what are these 4 methods of running a health service? Well, the first one is trust. I'll explain what they are in a moment. There's trust, mistrust. They were both in my title. Voice, and choice. And we've got those fundamental ways of doing these. We can trust people, we can mistrust people, we can allow them to exercise their voices, or we allow them to exercise their choices. Actually, we'll come to that in a moment. Let me go back now to trust. Trust is when, and I'm sure the audience, you'll like this one, trust is when you trust the doctors, and indeed you trust the nurses, and you trust the managers. You basically trust the people working in the system to allocate resources, to provide care according to the best that they can, according to their professional commitment, according to their sense of public service ethos, and so on. And you basically hand over the money, such as it is, to the health service and say, get on with it. No direction from the top, no markets or market pressures or whatever. You just hand the money over and allow people to get on with it. And the Blair government tried this when it came in. Frank Dobson, I don't remember Frank Dobson, he was health secretary, he was rather keen on this model. And he, when they came in 1997, they tried this model. Now, in many ways, it is a good model, I'm sure you'll agree, and I am, as a public service professional myself, I rather agree. I like to be trusted. I don't like being told what to do. I don't like being directed. University professors are slightly more recalcitrant than consultants, if you can imagine that. And we just don't like being ordered around, and we don't think it's productive, we don't think it's helpful. The trust model tends to lead to quite high morale among the people involved, and as I say, has many merits as a way of running a health service. What it doesn't do, or one of the difficult things about it is, particularly if you've got a kind of control freak government like Blair's government, what it doesn't do is necessarily deliver results. I remember and after a while Frank Dobson began to lose his lustre. In fact, he was sidelined to run for Mayor of London. I don't know if you remember that. And the new Secretary of State came in, Alan Milburn, who probably would have been cancelled. Now, Alan was much more of a kind of a can-do, thrusting kind of Secretary of State. I can remember talking to him at a conference once, a meeting, and he was sort of tearing his hair out because he said, we had begun to put more money into the health service, and they had at that time, not nearly as much as later went in, but they began to put in quite a reasonable amount. And nothing seems to be happening. We aren't getting, our waiting times are going up, our waiting lists are getting longer, there's no signs of sort of new increases in activity. I can't quite make out what's going on. And I could see that in a sense, he was losing faith in the trust model. And in fact, he did, and they went straight over to the mistrust model. And this is almost the reverse. This is where government says, we don't trust doctors, we don't trust nurses, we don't trust managers, we don't trust any of them. In fact, we don't trust anybody in the public sector. Sound familiar? We don't trust anybody in the public sector. They're all basically in it for themselves. They're purely in it for self-interest. They simply want to get as high incomes as possible, or as much leisure as possible, do as little work as possible. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to tell them what to do. We're going to have to direct them from start to finish. And of course, that's when we got to the era of targets. And to what's known, the euphemistic description was targets and performance management. The correct description was targets and terror. And Again, as you'll probably remember, what they did was they set, I say they because I wasn't involved in the government at that time, they set various targets, indeed, of course, as you know, they're still, some of them are still there, targets mostly for waiting times, it wasn't entirely, but mostly for waiting times of one kind or another. And basically instituted a system of rewards and penalties for people who met the target or failed to meet the target. Actually, as I'm sure Peter will observe, mostly penalties really rather than rewards. Not a great deal of, it was a very, I think it was a very punitive regime. The trouble is though, at least from a sort of analyst perspective, when you look at it, the trouble is it worked. At least it worked in a crude sense. We set a target for it, I'll go on to target, for instance, of the numbers of patients waiting in hospital greater than 12 months. I mean, in fact, it was extraordinary how many there were waiting longer than 12 months, and it was a shame on Britain. I mean, certainly I had a lot of colleagues who came from abroad to look at the British Health Service, which they admired many aspects of, but they were appalled at the waiting times, and indeed, of course, so was the general public. So I think it's not surprising, actually, that the government did focus on that. Set a target that nobody should wait longer than 12 months by 2003, and as you can see, the target was met. It's quite interesting because Scotland and Wales rejected the notion of targets, and despite the fact they had more resources per head than did England, that's what happened with them. That's the same happened with Northern Ireland. After a while, it has to be said, Wales and Scotland, or rather Wales anyway, introduced a sort of a more targeted regime, and so in Northern Ireland you got a result like that. It's a great, significant improvement. Scotland changed the system of measurement. Good trick, for every government, you've got a policy that's going wrong, change the system of measurement and it will solve a lot of problems. The same with A&E. I mean, the target was, I mean, originally the target that they wanted to set was 100% of people attending an A&E department would be seen, treated and discharged, or else admitted to hospital within 4 hours. They did do a bit of consultation, and they consulted with some of the A&E consultants about this, who said that's ridiculous, how 100%, could we have it 98%, and ended up with 98%. And as you can see, again, it was a target that was achieved, and that was despite a 24% of increase in A&E admittances through that time. So, targets seemed to work. Now, the trouble was, I felt uncomfortable with this, and so did I think a number of people actually, because we felt that in all sorts of subtle ways, targets were not working. They were directing resources, though there's the usual thing about what's targeted is resourced, what's not targeted is ignored. Not wholly true, actually. That was quite interesting. There was quite an interesting study of a set of Welsh hospitals and a set of English hospitals just either side of the border, with very similar case mix of hospitals, and the English hospitals being subject to targets and terror, and the Welsh hospitals not. And unsurprisingly, the study revealed that the English hospitals did better on the areas like waiting times and so on that were targeted. But it also turned out that they did rather better on just about every other indicator as well. And it looked as though the kind of general tightening up of management that went on, or the general tightening up all round that went on, in order to achieve the target, actually had beneficial effects elsewhere, with somewhat to our surprise, I think. It wasn't really what we were expecting. However, I didn't think then, and I still don't think that targets are the way to go. I still think they do distort resources, they do distort priorities. I'd be quite interested to hear your comments when we get a chance to talk about it. Of course, they create opportunities for gaming, so what the economists call gaming, that's to say, either outright fiddling with the figures, but more commonly, sort of shifting things around a bit, so as you meet the target, but you miss the point. In a sense, you don't actually, you don't actually you don't commit the spirit of the target. For instance, there was a big increase in accident and emergency, in people being admitted into the main hospital rather than being treated and discharged, even if, as the time approached for the 4 hours to be used up. And there were various things that went on in a variety of places that. And it just encouraged people in some ways to dodge and to duck and to weave, which doesn't seem to me to be a good way to run a health service. And I was at a meeting, and to be fair, neither did Blair. I was at a meeting with him once, and he was talking actually about this accident emergency case, and he's saying, do we just have to carry on doing this for the sort of the rest of our lives, so to speak? Do we have to sort of carry on cracking the whip from the top in some senses, driving these professionals to do this? Isn't there some way, he didn't quite use this language, but isn't there some way in which you could get a kind of drive to improve that was internal to the system? A drive to improve quality that was in some sense internal to what was going on. This was music to some of our ears because, as I say, many of his advisors and so on didn't really like the target stuff. And they said, well, yes, there are two ways that you can do that, and that is going back for a moment, voice and choice. Now, in both of these cases, what you do is you rely upon patients, basically, or you rely upon the people who use the health service to try to provide incentives to improve quality. With voice, you rely on people's voices. Its voice is a kind of ragbag of various ways of doing things, but it includes things like going and having a chat with your GP, going and having a chat with your consultant, maybe more formally, maybe sitting on an FT set of governors, maybe putting in a complaints procedure, maybe putting in a formal complaint, maybe talking to your councillors or to your MPs, maybe going along to some of the patient and public consultative fora, those sort of devices. Always sort of exercising your voice to achieve better quality service in some sense or another. On the whole, I mean, it's a bit surprising, but in some ways, but the Blair government wasn't terribly taken with voice. They did play around with it. You probably remember community health councils, abolished, and then various things, link schemes, PAL schemes, and so on. But they weren't really very taken with voice. But I say it's a little surprising because in many ways it's allegedly a left-wing government, and the left tends to like these kind of collectivist ways of doing things. But on the whole, they didn't go very far. And I think the reason was, again, it was felt not to be necessarily terribly effective. The two troubles with voice, I think. One is that it is quite clumsy as a way of trying to improve things, and it's quite difficult to mobilise. I was actually, when I was on the board of French Hospital in Bristol, I was the so-called complaints convener at one point, and I looked at the kind of hoops we made people jump through in order to make a complaint. I remember one person that put in 300 pages of typed. Now, I think he was something of a vexatious miscreant, as they say, and I don't think his complaint was very justified. But nonetheless, it did make me think, if you're really going to try and make a complaint, it's enormously difficult. And is that really a good way to go? And the patient and public forum weren't very successful in the community. Well, some people think the community health councils were very successful, actually, but the government didn't. And the other problem with voice, which was perhaps a little bit of a surprising one, was it tended to favour the better off. It was the middle classes, because inevitably they've got louder voices and they're more articulate. And they can do this kind of stuff. We did a little research into, and I'll just go on that for a moment, to looking at who got the most out of the NHS. It tended to be, on almost every level, one way or another, it tended to be the better off. In this case, it's the employed, the rich, the better educated tend to do better. If you looked at cabbages, you've got this kind of, you've got intervention rates were 30% lower in the lowest socioeconomic group and the highest. Hip replacements, rather similar. Even GPs spent less time per consultation with those lower down the economic scale. Now, I don't think in any sense this was the fault of the GPs or indeed any of the people involved in the health service. I'm sure that the GPs in the audience will be able to tell me that it's the wretched middle class people who clog up their surgeries with unnecessary questions and endless chat. And indeed, but in a way this is, and much of this is about the ability of the middle classes to manipulate the system is a little pejorative. It's not quite manipulating the system, but at least persuade the system to respond to their needs and wants to a greater degree than the less well off. So we did a live voice. So we moved to choice. I'll come to that in a moment. Choice. Now. So a range of measures were introduced to introduce patient choice of elective surgery, chiefly, as you know. And in addition, we moved towards reinstituting what we considered to be one of the more successful experiments that the previous government had done, which was GP fund holding. We moved toward, there's quite a lot of evidence coming out, GP fund holding has been rather effective in many ways. So we moved to something called, practice-based commissioning. If you remember practice-based commissioning. But the idea being that in some ways the GPs would hold the budget, but also they would be able to advise and help patients make choices between various providers, particularly for elective surgery. And we hoped that that would give, and coupled with the so-called payment by results system, the system in which the money followed the choice effectively, where patients did choose certain hospitals, those hospitals got more resources and provide an incentive for hospitals to attract patients. And we hoped that would improve the quality of the services being provided, provide an incentive to improve quality. And this is I was quite heavily involved in this. Competition is never a very, choice in competition is never a very, it's quite a hard one to defend actually, particularly in a world where we're used to, cooperation, to integration, to operate in a more networky fashion. It was tricky, and I'll come back to that in a moment. There have been quite a lot of results. There have been quite a lot of research now come out that's looked at the effects of competition. It's quite interesting. They did some studies of competition in the Conservatives regime. That was pre-1997 in the internal market. And they weren't so good on quality. They suggested that actually hospitals in more competitive areas tended to kill their patients faster. And actually that rather tied in with evidence when they looked at competition in the United States and elsewhere about the effects of competition. What it seemed to happen that if you allowed hospitals to compete on prices, so they could offer a lower price to GPs or whoever was buying the service, they would lower quality as well. So one of the things the government did was decided to try and keep the price constant, hence the idea of payment by results, the kind of the tariff, the same amount for everybody, not allow hospitals to compete on that. Instead, encourage them to compete on quality. And the results so far seem to be quite good. There have been 2 separate pieces of research that do suggest that hospital mortality decreased more quickly in hospitals in competitive markets, about 30% faster than it did in other hospitals. And there have been some estimates on the number of lives saved accordingly. Interestingly enough, there's also been some work looking at equity and fairness. That's more of a kind of quality indicator rather than a fairness. And looking at what happened to waiting times over that period. Now this isn't so much about choice and competition, I have to say. This is more about the whole Blair period from 1997 onwards. But in 1997, on the whole, the poor, for various elective surgery, the poor were waiting longer than the rich, or the middle classes generate, about 30 days longer. What happened over the years was that the waiting times dropped. We all know that. Waiting times dropped quite sharply. That was for knee replacement. But interestingly enough, what seemed to happen was they dropped faster for the poor, for the less well-off, than they did for the well-off. And the end result... let me go back here. If you look here, this is 1997, you've got that's a rough gradient with this being social class 1, the top social class, and this being the social class 5. And if you look what's happened down here, if anything, social class 5 is pretty equal, actually. The social class 5 are waiting less time than social class 1. So the combination of the Blair reforms, which started, I suppose, around about here, when you began to see this decline in waiting times. And this is about the time that choice and competition came in, but also there was the targets and terror regime was going on, was an improvement in the equity or the fairness of the system as well. I suppose what that means is, and perhaps we can discuss this in a moment, that for me on the whole, competition and choice is perhaps the least worst way of doing things. I know all the problems of competition and choice, and I know it leads to fragmentation. It can lead to collapse of morale. You've got problems about hospitals which, through no fault of their own, get into financial trouble and so on. So there's a whole range of difficulties with choice competition, and we can come to that in a moment. And there are areas of the country where it's totally inappropriate to have choice of competition, and there are areas of care where you might think it's totally inappropriate. But on balance, I think that of all the 4 models that we've talked about so far, probably the one that, as I say, is the least worst in terms of delivery, maybe choice of competition, but we can talk about that in a moment. Let me conclude by just talking a bit about the politics of this, because it was all quite fun. Not everybody was very enthusiastic about this line of any manner of means. Frank Dobson didn't like it. The real opposition, which at that time was led by Gordon Brown, in the Treasury, they didn't like it much either. And it was quite difficult to sell. It is quite difficult to sell choice and competition. Quite a lot of other people didn't like it much either. And of course, it's very relevant to the kind of discussions we're going on now. We're getting a lot of this kind of development. I was always a little upset at the privatisation accusation because we weren't talking about privatising the health service. I'm not talking about, obviously we weren't talking about charging for the health service, for healthcare, and we weren't talking too about, there was a certain amount of bringing private providers, but not a lot. It was mostly about setting up a foundation trusts and operating in that way. I did ask my research assistant to go out and find some pro-choice cartoons. She came up with this one. I'm not entirely sure I regard it as pro-choice. She said as far as she was concerned it was. It's only a generation thing. She said, well, that's what I want my health service to look like. She's 24 or 25. Still, anyway. But these are the kind of challenges we got about choice particularly, all making perfectly sort of legitimate points. Oh, sorry. People don't want choice, they want a good local service. Yes. There's an inequity point. The better, I talked about the problems with voice, problems the middle class is getting privileges with voice. We've got some problems here. And choice competition, and there is this fundamental worry, and I think this is a real worry actually, that choice competition will undermine the public service ethos. It will undermine the sense of commitment that the professionalisation that people have, and it sort of threatens the kind of public realm. Well, as I say, I think all of those, I mean, they're reasonable points. On the people, but we did do a bit of research about whether people wanted choice. What was quite interesting was that on the whole, people did seem to want choice, actually. And it tended to be the less powerful who wanted choice. It was women, and there were majorities in each group wanting choice, but it tended to be women more than men wanted choice. The lower, the lower social classes, so to speak, tended to want choice more than the upper social classes. The income, it was that there's over £50,000, they still wanted choice, a majority, but much less than the proportion of those who are earning less than £10,000. And so on, same true of education, that those with higher education wanted choice, but not as much as those with no education, which is, I think, quite interesting. And actually, this is a fairly universal phenomenon. If you look across not just healthcare, but if you look across education and you talk about choice in schools, you get a rather similar pattern. If you look across other countries, the United States, New Zealand, Finland, you tend to get this pattern with the poor tending to want more choice than the better off. It might be quite interesting to think about why that might be. I think it's partly because the poor are often stuck with lousy services. Not always, but often stuck with lousy services. And so they see the opportunity to get out in some sense, to get to a better service. And of course the middle classes are better able, as we indicated about voice, they're better able to use a non-choice system to their own advantage. So I think that might be some of the reasons that goes on. We did do some piloting of this, of the choice idea, to see whether different groups, whether men and women, people with different educations, different employment status, whether they actually would use the choice system. And they might say they wanted choice, but we don't know whether they actually use it. And as you can see, there's not a great deal of difference, actually, here between the various groups. On the whole, it didn't seem as though we thought, again, there was a danger that the poor wouldn't use the choice system, or the less well-off wouldn't use it. And this is what the final thing. This is an uncomfortable thing when we asked people about what they thought about public services in Britain. We were trying to sort of get some feel for whether people cared very much about public versus private, the rest of it. and we asked them what they conveyed about, what they thought about public service in Britain. This is right across the board, public services. And we got this kind of result, which isn't, I must say, doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. And I suppose they do think that were hard working. That's one nice thing about those of us in the public sector. They were hard working, but the rest of it is not very reassuring about the way they choose. Now, we did discover actually in doing this research that most people still thought that British gas and the utilities generally were still part of the public sector. So we may be picking up a British gas effect. Certainly that's rather what we hope. Those of us who work in the health service or in education. But it does suggest that they don't think that the people who work in public service are very good. I think and this is a final survey that we did where we looked at about this issue about private hospitals, because obviously that was a major issue now. And whether people really minded about that when they wanted the public sector. And on the whole, they didn't seem to, as you can see. But you have to be careful with this kind of stuff, as I'm sure any of you if you ask the right question, you can get the answer you want. So I wouldn't necessarily take that all too seriously. So let me finish then by saying, well, for those of you who are academics or are interested in the academic stuff, this is some of the evidence I've been citing, some of the references on the evidence I've been citing. And this will be, I think this will be available if anyone wants to check it out. So, where does that leave us? Well, particularly about the present healthcare reforms that are going on. I think they're daft, frankly. Or rather, more accurately, what I think of, that it seemed to me that the Blair, well, I would say this wouldn't I, but the Blair government probably got it about right. A little bit of competition, a little bit of choice. I mean, not massive amounts. It wasn't massive. A little bit of competition, a little bit of choice. Some use of targets, and as we saw, on the whole, a payoff of improved quality and improved equity. There were various things that were introduced, like practice-based commissioning for GP commissioning, and really, the present government, when the new government came in, they didn't need to do any of this. They really didn't need to do any of this. They could have just built on, if they wanted to, the various things that had been done by the previous government, and otherwise left things pretty well as they were. And I think that would have been a much better strategy, and indeed I've written to say they should have withdrawn the bill, and the bill has gone mad. I don't think actually, though, having said that once it goes through, I don't think things will change very much. They change on the GP commissioning side, of course, and PCTs. Obviously anyone who works in the PCT obviously things have changed very much. As far as hospitals are concerned, I think patients will still come to hospital, doctors will, and nurses will still treat the patients, and they'll probably do so much in the same way as they ever did. And so with all the sound and the fury that emanates from number 10 and elsewhere, at the end of the day, your lives, I think, will carry on much as they always have. And indeed, I very much hope they do, because you're doing a great job. So, thank you.
And you're happy to answer some questions, aren't you, before we switch for train? So, any questions? Okay.
Hi, I'm a GP. And thank you very much for what was a very thoughtful and insightful talk, actually. But something has puzzled me from your years advising the government that I've never been able to understand, and perhaps you can explain it to me. It's on the question of choice. I'm at the beginning of the choice process. When I see patients and the surgeon, I choose to refer them. And it's to where? The government, thank you. The government that you advised set up a system of choice whereby our patients were encouraged to choose not to have their knee replaced in Nottingham, but to go to Exeter or Carlisle if they wished. But in actual fact, the only choice my patients have ever expressed to me is to have their knee replaced by the chap who replaced the previous knee. And that was explicitly stopped.
Can you just repeat that?
The choice that patients want is the surgeon that will do the job best locally.
Yes.
If you've had one knee replaced and it's been a good job, you want to get the next knee replaced by the same surgeon. And that was explicitly ruled out in Chosen Book. And I cannot see why you did this.
Yes, well, I will rapidly say that I didn't do it. I don't think I'm slightly surprised that I don't think it was actually ruled out that you should go to a local hospital. It was just one on the list. And if it was actually explicitly ruled out, there was something going wrong with the Chosen Book system that shouldn't have happened in that case.
No, we can't. The problem is that we cannot name consultants.
Oh, right.
It means you send to a service.
Right.
But patients don't see the service as being what they had the last time.
No.
They want Mr. X.
Well, I think we should have named consultants. I think that opportunity should be open to patients. And indeed, we did talk about and indeed try to get that. But on the whole, it tends to be the consultants who are not so keen on that, in our experience. But maybe that's unrepresentative. But yes, I quite agree. I think that's the way we should move towards that. I mean, your more general point about patients don't, what they want is a good local service. Of course, in a sense, that's bound to be true. I mean, if you offer somebody a choice of televisions or a high-quality television, what will they go for? Well, obviously, they'll go for the high-quality television. I mean, the point more is about the choice and competition argument is that some people, often people in relatively poor areas, are not getting a very good service. And if they have the choice to go somewhere else, then that does give a strong incentive for the service to improve. You don't need very many people to exercise choice, actually. The evidence tends to be only about 5 or 10% of people need exercise choice to give this kind of push to quality improvement.
Professor Legrand, I enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much. You mentioned 4 ways of running the health service. Isn't there a 5th way? Taking the health service out of politics. Because every Secretary of State that comes likes to put his stamp and do a reform, and there's reform fatigue. And how can the Secretary of State know better than the people who are actually giving the service and running the service? Of course, those people need help from lawyers, administrators, accountants. Have a board of governors, say like the BBC, and they have a budget, and then they can provide the best possible long-term service without political interference. Isn't that the 5th way?
Well, I think that's close to what I would call the trust model, actually. It is when basically the political system stands back from the whole business, hands over the money, and allows people to get on with the job. And as I say, I think it's a model that has some merit. And to be fair to the present government, that's one of the things they think they're trying to do by setting up this national commissioning board. The idea is that they set up this board that is going to be composed of the great and the good, but not politicians. The politicians stand back and then allow the National Commissioning Board to do its job. I don't know whether I think it'll work at the end of the day. I mean, you're talking about £100 billion of public money. If this National Commissioning Board really was the great and indeed the good, and if they were very effective, then maybe it'll work. It's the trouble in a sense with all kind of dictatorships. And a bit of the problem with the targets and terror regime was that if you've got a benevolent dictator who's not subject to any kind of democratic accountability or control, and is also extremely competent, That's probably the best way to run these, whether it's a railway, whether it's a government, or whether it's a health service. The sag is that dictators often end up, they might start off as benevolent, but they often end up as somewhat malevolent, and they often end up as fairly incompetent. And whether they're less competent than the politicians concerned, I'm not sure. So, but I also, on a more pragmatic level, I just don't see the politicians ever really be able to stand back from £100 billion and allow that money to be spent without control. But it's an interesting idea.
My problem with competition is that, particularly between the NHS and the private sector, is that you're not competing on a level playing field. For example, private sector hospitals are purely going to be dealing with elective surgery. They've no responsibility whatsoever for emergency services. They haven't got any responsibility for training. And more importantly, they're not saddled with things like enormous PFIs. Therefore, how can the NHS compete? They certainly can't compete financially.
Well, yes, and certainly that was a problem when we started. There was the independent sector treatment centres, which was set up in the you have one, so it's a cycle. Nearby. Well, to be fair to them, their contract was it came. That idea rather came again from so many ideas, both good and bad, come from the United States. The idea of so-called focus factories, where you set up specialised centres that only do simple operations but do them speedily. And they don't engage in training, and they don't do emergency, all the things you were saying, they don't do any of that. And the evidence from the States was that on the whole that worked quite well. That on the whole they did operated effectively and speedily. And so it was tried here, and of course there weren't only independent sector treatment centres were set up, there were also NHS treatment centres were set up to try and work. And I think the results of that experiment, some have worked, some haven't, frankly. And where they've worked, as indeed you're saying, some people would argue, well, they've worked partly because of the very simple job they've been given, in a sense. Some of the NHS treatment centres have done well too. The private sector ones and the NHS ones have done well. I think, in terms of your sort of basic argument, that if you are going to have genuine competition, then you do need to have a level playing field. And I think that's absolutely unequivocally the case. And that must be, and insofar if we are going to move to a world, which frankly I suspect we're not greatly, despite Circle just taking over Hinchinbrook, I think. I don't think we're probably going to move to a very much of a world where there's going to be a great deal of private sector involved, but if we are, it's got to be fair.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was absolutely fascinating, and really what I'd like to ask you is something relating to the current health reforms. And one of the problems that we work in silos. We have secondary care, we have primary care. Secondary care has payment by results, which is really payments by activity, and primary care is trying to stop people going to hospital. So really the question is what do you think about the concept of unified budgets based on a patient journey? And secondly, the next question would be, what do you think about the concept of personal health budgets?
Well, I'm glad you asked that last question, because the last paper I wrote for Blair was on personal health budgets. And I was quite intrigued by the idea, and indeed advocated. And indeed, of course, there are the personal health budget pilots. You're not involved in any of them, are you?
I'm peripherally involved through the Royal College of GPs as one of the sort of leads for.
Well, in that case, maybe you should answer about whether you think they're working or not. I'm not sure what the present whether people do think that they are working. Do you know? Do you have a feel for that?
Personal health budgets is again something which may well exacerbate health inequalities in my view. That those that are more affluent, more able to make choices, will do so and will handle a budget very well. those who are most disadvantaged in society will have great difficulty.
Great difficulty in doing it, yes. Well, I mean, in general, though, going back to your first point, I mean, I am rather in favour of unified budgets. I do think that is a way of trying to unify the patient journey and to have one person or one set of people who are basically sort of guiding the patient through this and responsible for it and accountable for it. So, I mean, basically, and I think to some extent the GP commissioning route is a way of doing that. So I am, yes, quite sympathetic to that.
Thank you very much. As a clinical trialist, we often use a randomised controlled trial as deciding whether one thing is better than another. I've been fascinated in my career in seeing how health service developments have happened in a sporadic fashion, and the true trials are seldom done. Would you say that was right, or do you feel there's true trials taking place, or what methods would you use that would equal the randomised?
Well, it certainly wasn't RCTs, no. But to be fair, yes, there was some piloting of various things. There was I showed some results from the London Choice pilots. There was choice for cardiac surgery. There was and there was choice for cataracts, and there was an experiment. There was a deliberate attempt to actually try to evaluate what came out. And interesting enough, some of the research that I referred to, particularly research on competition, what that's done, and it's quite interesting methodologically, is that it so happened that choice and competition were introduced at different rates in different parts of the country. And so you have got, in some sense, a natural experiment. You've got the same amount of money in, and you're controlling for quite a lot of the similarities. But you've got some areas where you've got choice and competition rampant, so to speak, and some areas where you haven't. And by comparing the performance of those two, you can get some indication of what happens. And indeed, that was some of the results that were going on there. But I must say, your general point, I would really like to see far more piloting, far more experimentation of these kind of reforms, but before they're rolled out across the whole country.
Maybe I just have one final question. Rupert Ayton here, who is our Director of Finance, so he's been listening to all the replies now. This is going to be a killer.
I think it's a killer question. Julian, thank you for the talk. It was really, really interesting. During the period of the Blair government was when the UK really started to step up its investment in health, both in absolute terms and as a proportion of GDP. Do you think we got value for money out of all that extra funding that's gone in?
As usual, let me qualify that. We did get, I think people were expected an increase in productivity. That's to say, they hoped that we would get, that if you've got a 10% increase in the money going in, you get a more than 10% increase in the job done at the end of the day. That hasn't what's happened. What's happened is there's been a 10% increase in, well, there's been much more than 10% increase, 100% increase in the resources going in, and a 90% or whatever increase in the output coming out, which is a drop in productivity. Still, it is worth noting there has been an increase in production. It's not that when people, and in fact, Tony Blair himself made this mistake when I had a little argument with him about it. He thought that when the people said there's been a fall in productivity, it meant that actually we put all this money in and actually things have gone downhill. Well, that's not the case. It's just that things didn't increase quite as fast as the rate of resources going in. Again, it does look a bit as though, now this is more about the targets and terror regime. There have been some interesting comparisons, again, not quite an RCT, but a comparison between Scotland and Wales do offer a rather useful sort of almost a laboratory experiment. And it does look as though productivity fell faster, so to speak, in Scotland and Wales than it did in comparable areas of England, the northeast of England and Wales, really. So it does look as though the target and terror regime particularly wasn't too bad as far as practice is concerned, but on the whole we have poured in a lot of money, and things have got better, but maybe not quite as good as we'd hoped.
Okay, that's great. We'll leave that for questions. Thank you very much for taking the time to extend your talking time. Can I ask if Peter Homer could just say a few words?
Thank you, Julian. On behalf of all of us, I think been enthralled by your commentary and insights. Can I thank you very much indeed for disturbing a very busy schedule. I know you're travelling back immediately in order to get up at a horrendous hour in the morning in order to attend to various duties. And in life, ladies and gentlemen, there are many gifts that we can have. Good health, you help to provide that. Good friends, good colleagues, good teachers. Julian doesn't know this, but Julian is one of 2 individuals who influenced my choice of career. And he had that effect on very many of his students. And I think this evening we've had the benefit of a very balanced, unusually balanced in the sense of someone who's been so close to the proximity of power, a very balanced perspective on what works, what doesn't work, what's least worst. And Julian, you have provided us with a privileged glimpse under the bonnet of government, with all the messy components of the imperfections of decisions beset by the demands of electoral convenience and the metronome of when elections are called. And I'm sure that your conversations, the conversations we have, will resonate with echoes of both your phrases and your concepts. So on behalf of all of us, Julian, thank you so much for an enthralling evening.
Very much to know. Before everyone repairs to the lounge again, we've got one final but really, really important duty. Tanya, would you be prepared to come down to the front, please? Now, Tanya Nadar is our administrator for the society, works part-time, has a shed load of work to do, does it uncomplainingly, and as you may or may not have spotted, here we are, that's where that £10 million went. And Tanya next week is off on her well-deserved maternity leave, thank you very much. We're looking forward to you coming back. So we've got you small. No, it's all down to you helping us. If I could give you this, maybe I shouldn't give you anything to carry. And there's a small spray of orchids to wear in your hair tomorrow. And there's a present that will buy a few disposable napkins. For everyone coming, please make use of the coffee and tea, and that's that. We'll see you on the 7th of December. Thank you very much.